At the end of his speech accepting the Buchner Prize, Paul Celan closed with the comment, "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your presence." Presence in the hands of Celan is hardly a noun to be taken for granted. For him and for those who are connected with his work, language itself implies the presence of all who have spoken it. Celan writes, "We converse with language, despite and with all its speakers." For Celan, the comprehension of a poem is directly related to the capacity for presence, quote, "the ability of being with it." This persistence and faithful presence to something so integral and all-involving is a quality we will be in the presence of tonight in the form of Pierre Joris. Joris, a poet and translator who has devoted almost 50 years to fathoming the work and words of Paul Celan, is a testament to a kind of fidelity which is not just the faithfulness we speak of when we admire a translation, but a fidelity to the whole and to the changing knowledge of that whole over time and space. Quote, "I am a poet," writes Joris, "not a theorist or philosopher, but I make the arrogant claim that the poet is possibly the last, in Robert Kelly's words, scientist of the whole, to whom all data whatsoever are of use." Tonight, we are honored to present an event that represents this totality by drawing upon many media and the enduring collaborative partnership of Pierre Joris and Nicole Peyrafitte. On an evening when your presence has presented with so many obstacles, I thank you for it, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Pierre Joris.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, there were a few obstacles, but it all went fine. I first came across Paul Celan 50 years ago in high school, in 1961. My German literature teacher brought in a peripatetic scholar, actor, who gave us a reading of current German poetry. That was in Luxembourg, where I was raised and brought up. I already had an interest in poetry. Now, I had come across Gottfried Benn, who I still think of very highly, and some of the modernist French poets. But something strange happened that day. After a reading of poems by Günter Eich, Karl Krollo, Heinz Piontek, these so-called Bestandsaufnahme poets, that is, those poets who were trying to create a new German poetry after the war, very tight, constructed little poems. Interesting, but they didn't bowl me over. Well, after that, the man read Paul Celan's Todesfuge, and my hair stood on end. The poem went through me like a knife through butter. It cut me open. It flayed me, laid me out completely. I think it was maybe the only absolute epiphany I had in my life in relation to language. Now, this was not, or neither, it was neither the beauty of the music nor of the poem's melodic fugal construction by itself, nor the obvious horror of the content, speaking of the burial in the air of the Jews exterminated in the camps. It was none of those two that created the effect. What the effect came from was the abyss opened by the paradoxical combination of those two elements. It was that abyss into which I fell. It was a contradictory doubleness of that chiasmus that tore me open. Later on, I heard a reading of that poem by Paul Celan himself, a recording I will now play for you, and you can follow it via the first American translation of that poem, which was Jerome Rothenberg, which Rothenberg published in '58 in that little book from City Lights called New German Poetry.
Todesfuge. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken sie abends, wir trinken sie mittags und morgens, wir trinken sie nachts, wir trinken und trinken. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er schreibt es und tritt vor das Haus, und es blitzen die Sterne, er pfeift seine Rüden herbei, er pfeift seine Juden hervor, lässt schaufeln ein Grab in der Erde. Er befiehlt uns, spielt auf nun zum Tanz. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich morgens und mittags, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit. Wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Er ruft, stecht tiefer ins Erdreich, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Er greift nach dem Eisen im Gurt, er schwingt, seine Augen sind blau. Stecht tiefer die Spaten, ihr einen, ihr anderen spielt weiter zum Tanz auf. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags und morgens, wir trinken dich abends, wir trinken und trinken. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete, dein aschenes Haar, Sulamite, er spielt mit den Schlangen. Er ruft, spielt süßer den Tod, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Er ruft, streicht dunkler die Geigen, dann steigt ihr als Rauch in die Luft. Dann habt ihr ein Grab in den Wolken, da liegt man nicht eng. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken dich nachts, wir trinken dich mittags, der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Wir trinken dich abends und morgens, wir trinken und trinken. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Er trifft dich mit bleierner Kugel, er trifft dich genau. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Er hetzt seine Rüden auf uns, er schenkt uns ein Grab in der Luft. Er spielt mit den Schlangen und träumet. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. Dein goldenes Haar, Margarete. Dein aschenes Haar, Sulamit.
I kept reading Paul Celan. I kept buying the books as they came out. And soon I went off to study medicine in Paris, as Celan had done coming from Czernowitz to Tours in 1938. I quit after 2 years. He had been forced to quit after 1 year because of the impending war, to study literature and become writers. He in German, the mother tongue, but also terrifyingly, the language of his mother's assassins, and I in English, my fourth language, never having been taught to write the mother tongue, Luxembourgish. By this time, the middle 60s, Celan had turned away from that early, lush, late surrealist and symbolically laden language. And this turn, or Wende in German, a term inscribed in the title of the volume, Atemwende, breath turn, was caused by several factors. One, the misuse of the Todesfuge in Germany, where it had been widely anthologized and put into school books, and was kind of trotted out as an alibi for a supposedly successful Überwältigungsprozess, i.e. the process of having overcome the guilt and the trauma caused by the Nazi past. But if you read in the student edition, in the teacher's editions, what the teacher was supposed to tell the students about the poem, well, that concerned only the formal elements, never the content of the poem. Celan saw that and pulled the poem back and never again had it anthologized in Germany. Then there were, of course, the false accusation of plagiarism that had come from the widow of the poet Ivan Goll, and which had caused a lot of psychic distress to Celan and would turn the last decade of his life, i.e. the 60s, into a kind of hell. Now, last night I was teaching my students this, and then I woke up this morning at 5 and said, I have to make an insert here, off the cuff. There is stuff here that needs to be said. Celan is often accused to have been paranoid, to have been psychically ill, to have exaggerated what was going on, etc., etc., or that has been laid simply on the fact of him as a survivor. Now, I think, in fact, Celan was much closer to the facts. And in that sense, I thought, and I used the term in the introduction to the Selected, closer to what William Burroughs said when he said, a paranoid is a man who knows the facts. A couple of things in relation to that. We think in a kind of rose-tinted glasses about Germany, post-war Germany. The Marshall Plan, the Wirtschaftswunder, everything becomes wonderful, the Americans are there, and so on. Now think of this. In 1949, the year the new German state was founded, the first thing, one of the first laws passed was the law that forbade the pursuit for criminal activities of the previous Nazi criminals. By the next year, anybody could re-enter the civil service. That is, the little effect, the little work on denazification, which the troops, the occupying forces had done in the late 40s, that the denazification was stopped, which meant that from that moment on, there were tens of thousands of Germans who had 5 years earlier been card-carrying Nazis, who became judges, DAs, professors, policemen, who re-entered the social society completely without any check, right? Now, somebody like Celan, who sits in Paris, and we know goes out every morning, buys the German papers, reads them, yes, to see if they say something about him, yes, to make sure that they're not lying about him, is obviously very sensitive to those facts. And they are facts. If you think that the Todesfuge, the poem, not only what I said earlier about it being misused in anthologies, but one of the first reviews by a big German poet, Heinz Piontek, spoke of the poem and said, this is a totally marvelous imaginary construct, a surreal fantasy with totally no relation to reality. Of course, at that moment, nearly nobody knew that Heinz Piontek in the war had been an SS officer, right? So I think Celan, what is passed off often as Celan's paranoia, is actually facts that the man knew. Let me get back to the narrative, back to the poems. So emblematic for this turn, Die Wende, is the rewriting of that Todesfuge in the poem Engführung, translated as Stretto. And you can see the relationship you have. The title is again a fugal, a reference to the art of the fugue. A longish poem that closes the volume Sprachgitter, whose poetics make such recuperation impossible, as the poem now eschews, avoids the beautiful images and the melodic music that is core to the Todesfuge. The new poem's matter also widens its historical perspective. Hiroshima now stands beside Auschwitz as a historical moment of horror. Given the, quote, sinister events in his memory, wrote Celan, the language of German poetry has to become more sober, more factual, grayer. This greater factuality checks a core impulse of the lyrical tradition, i.e. its relation to the lyre inside of lyrical, that is the music. Celan, again, it is a language which wants to locate even its musicality in such a way that it has nothing in common with the euphony which more or less blithely continue to sound alongside the greatest horrors. End of quote. The direct effect of giving up this euphony is to increase the accuracy of language. Quote, it does not transfigure or render poetical. It names, it posits, it tries to measure the area of the given and the possible. End of quote. Core to such a poetry is an insistence on and a quarrying of the word itself, of the single word and the numerous new semantic formations Celan's telescoping of words creates. the poems become richly, at times dizzyingly, polysemic, and in the process shed all facile, representational, and symbolizing functions. There is a directness, a literalness, perceptible in even the most abstract sounding of his construct that forces one to take Celan at his word, literally. A further aspect of this turn in Celan's poetics concerns the unit of the poem itself. Until Atemwende, breath turn, his poems had been well-defined, self-contained units with individual titles declaring discoherence, mirroring a neoclassical modernist faith in the achieved or achievable single masterpiece poem. But from the early 60s on, the method of composition becomes serial or cyclical, and the volumes usually arrange the poems chronologically in the order of composition, and the books are divided in a number of small cycles. One needs to retrain one's reading habits and try to read a single poem as a phrase or a sentence in a much longer composition, while thinking of a given cycle as a completed and yet open-ended sequence, sentence. It took me a few years to do this, and as I've said elsewhere, given that translation is the best, the closest way of reading, I started to seriously translate Celan. Between 68 and 69, as an undergraduate at Bard College, I translated the complete volume Atemwende, his most recent book, as my senior project thesis. Difficult but exhilarating work, as there was no critical thing to fall back on. I think there were 4 reviews of that volume in German papers, and they were all relatively negative because they were stunned by what Celan was doing. You know, that early stuff was no longer readable, and so I had nothing to go on except my own sense of there is something here that is very important. And the only person I showed my translations to who could actually look at them was the poet Robert Kelly, who was my advisor, my faculty advisor at that time. Let me read you the opening poem from that book. Du darfst mich getrost mit Schnee bewirten, so oft ich Schulter an Schulter mit dem Maulbeerbaum schritt durch den Sommer, schrie sein jüngstes Blatt. You may confidently regale me with snow, as often as I strode through summer, shoulder to shoulder with the mulberry tree, its youngest leaf shrieked. In preparation for this talk tonight, my son Miles and Sylvia Gorlick, now students at Bard themselves, photocopied a few pages from the undergraduate thesis that is still at Bard. So to my surprise, I in fact had added a sequence of my own poems concerned with Celan. I am happy that they remain buried completely, and I will not bring them out, but I will quickly give you a couple lines so you can see I was, you know, that need to write through someone to get rid of, to understand. After rereading Celan's Atemwende, iceberg speech, snow script, wanting to break through the unsingable remnant. If you know Celan, you know that most of those are different combinations of Celan's word. I finished that poem with that old Ramboldian chestnut, Je est un autre, which was, of course, very, very important. And I would now change that poem if I wanted to read it and say, Je et un autre, I and another. Because my sense all of a sudden became that Celan, that figure of the survivor, is a je, an I, but who has a father, a mother, a sister, or children, and so on, and who exists as that. After Chorben, as Rothenberg says, Shoah, that I becomes another. It is not another, but you have 2 people there. You have that other, that is still a father or something, but something has happened, and the I is no longer there. So all of a sudden I began saying, Je et un autre, I and another, a kind of double, a de-doubling in personality. It is a very difficult way to try to live that way, and in April 1970, Paul Celan committed suicide by jumping into the Seine from the Pont Mirabeau, a bridge and the title of a poem, as you all know. I moved back to Europe in 1972, sad that I now would never be able to meet Celan. In the late 60s, I'd been too shy and too young to even attempt such a meeting, which in hindsight would probably have been catastrophic, given Celan's state of mind in those last years. I was now interested in publishing my translations, but this was to be impossible for many years, as the English language rights were sewn up by Carcanet, the publisher, and by Michael Hamburger. And Celan had liked Michael's translations, and so his widow, Gisèle, decided to take Celan's liking as the law, and said, no, in English it will be only Michael Hamburger. I continued, nevertheless, to translate the new work as it came out, and when in Paris, I was based in London during much of that decade, I would try to track down the places he had frequented. Thus, I went to sit at a café on the Place de la Contrescarpe, translating Celan's poem by that name, which taught me further details about his life. And years later in Berlin, I would track down the places in this poem. And thus I walked to the Anhalter Bahnhof that is central in that poem.
Via Krakow you came. At the Anhalter railway station, a smoke flowed towards your glance. It already belonged to tomorrow. Under Paulownia's, you saw the knives stand, again, sharp from the distance. There was dancing, 14 juillet, et plus de 9 autres. Uberdwarf, Aperverse, Schoolmouth, mimed lived experience. The Lord stepped, wrapped in a wood banner, to the troop. He snapped a little souvenir, the self-timer. That was you.
There's another poem with the Anhalter Bahnhof in it, written in Berlin some years later by Celan. Lilac air with yellow window stains. Orion's belt above the Anhalter ruin. Flame hour, nothing intercurrent yet. From standing bar to snow bar. The importance of the Anhalter Bahnhof is, of course, that he arrived on his way to tour from Krakow, he stopped in Berlin and then moved on to Paris, coming from Czernowitz. The date of that was the night of the 9th to the 10th November 1938, a Kristallnacht. So that when he speaks of those flames, of what was happening, it was that moment, that historical moment that he arrived there. Reading, translating, and thinking through Celan's poetics made him so central to my life that I needed to deal very consciously, and more so than I had in that early poem, with his influence on my work. Celan obviously is not somebody you can imitate as a poet, young or old, but I needed to kind of write through Celan, and I wrote a sequence of poems that I began to think of as a kind of alchemical action of transformation. And so I created a figure I called Nelec, which is Paul Celan spelled backwards. And a sequence of 4 poems with a citational 2-page hinge in the middle came laboriously into being in 75-76. And permit me to read a bit from the opening poem. The birth of Nelec. Somewhere a door closes. I am not awake, alone. I am thinking of you, lady, la nuit américaine. I'm thinking the strong body of America arched night over an affectic Europe. Anthropocephalus, God's peace. Ben would have that coin. Age that knew the brain's skin. Roman des Phenotype, played doctor, wrote morgue, died. Celan dares go further. Fadensan through threadbare web. His breath turned to water. That poem goes on for a long time. I will not go there. This is about Celan. So this poem also spoke at some place of the death of Europe. And by the mid-70s, my relation to Europe had very much disintegrated, and I wanted out because I really had that feeling that culturally, in many ways, it was a dead place. But rather than returning to New York, I went to Constantine, Algeria, where I taught at the university for 3 years. Despite the time teaching and discovering another culture, language, and landscape, it takes a lot of time to do that. There was time left to go over the 3 volumes of Celan's poem I'd nearly finished translating by then. That's Breast Turn, Thread Sons, and Light Duress, and work on more posthumous poetry. It was, in fact, an eerie, displaced pleasure to sit, say, in the Hôtel Transatlantique in the Saharan oasis of El-Oued and spend hours under the date palms in great late summer heat, working on Celan poems like this one from the volume Schneepart. Well graves in the wind, someone will play the viola, day downward in the alehouse. Someone will stand on his head in the word enough. Someone will hang cross-legged in the gateway next to the winch. This year does not roar over. It throws back December, November, it turns up its wounds. It opens up to you. Young grave well, 12-mouthed. But at the same time, I was growing frustrated with the seeming impossibility of publishing these books. Oh, I did place individual poems and sequences in magazines in the US and in England. And in London, the American poet Asa Benveniste, who had moved to England, where he published a wonderful press called Trigram, tried very hard to publish Atemwende, tried to get the rights, but to no avail. So I decided to rework Breast Turn, and I reworked the poems in Constantine over the last year there, using the hermeneutics material that had been published by then. There were by then hundreds of articles. All of a sudden the floodgates had opened, and Celan had become a salonfähiger Dichter for critical response. And what that led me to was to make much more open, more free translations, kind of breaking down the tightness, the imitative tightness of the structures that I had in the first versions, kept and felt needed to be kept as faithful as possible. I moved back to England in late '79, in fact sharing time between London and Paris for the next 8 years, and kept working on these translations, but not as intensely given the impossibility of publishing the books. In the early '80s, I was spending more time in Paris again, specifically with people from the avant-garde Change group of writers. And one of these, Didier Pemel, introduced me to his then girlfriend, the poet and translator Martine Brodat. It immediately became clear that Martine's major translation work concerned Paul Celan, and that she was as engaged a Celanian as I was. She was very friendly with Gisèle Celan-Lestrange, the widow, and it was thus Martine and Didier who introduced me to Gisèle over a dinner in a restaurant in the Rue des Rosiers in the Marais. I remember that place always. This was, of course, a very moving meeting for me, and Gisèle turned out to be a warm, very open person, profoundly involved with her husband's work. Despite the separation between husband and wife during the last years of Celan's life, after his attempt to kill her in a moment of mental meltdown. In fact, he more tried to kill himself. He stabbed himself with a kind of, stabbed at her and then stabbed himself with a letter opener. So one of those things. After that, because of the young son, Gisèle thought it would be better if they didn't live in the same place anymore. But the two kept, of course, very close relations until the end. And during the 60s, as Gisèle's own work as an artist had really come into fabulous flowering, she and Celan did a number of books together. A lot of the etchings here, the etchings of her works. We became good friends, and whenever I'd come to Paris from London, we would meet for drinks in her apartment in the Rue Montorgueil, and she would show me her most recent work and then would talk of the publishing situation of Paul Celan's oeuvre, with Gisèle offering me copies of the most recent books that had come out. I began to broach the question of translation, suggesting that Celan was a poet of such size and complexity that it would be a disservice to limit translations to one version in any given language. In English, for example, either because Paul had liked Hamburger's versions or because the publishers, Carcanet, wanted a monopoly on Celan's ever-growing fame throughout the world, which was, of course, making all of a sudden for poetry that paid, right, for income to the publishers. My argument, however, was wider than just trying to get Gisèle to help me get my translation published. I remember the line that I used most often with her was, "Let 1,000 translations bloom." In that sense that, you had to do that. And I think she was receptive to the idea and made suggestions to the German publisher, Surkamp Verlag, who had been more than reluctant to consider the possibility of other English language versions. But these matters progressed extremely slowly. And as I was also busy elsewhere, trying to make a living in England, which turned out to be impossible, and so my Paris trips became more frequent until I moved there and became a freelance journalist, cultural journalist for France Culture. But I kept visiting Gisèle, and plans were hatched. But they come to nothing, as then my nomadic life moved me back to the States in '87. It is, however, also in the early '80s, with the publication of the collected works, that it became obvious that Celan was also a major translator. The extent and excellence of his work in that field left me speechless. He translated roughly 1,000 pages of poetry from half a dozen languages. I was just shown a very rare book that they have here, which I think there's only 2 copies left extant, and it was a translation of a Russian text by Celan into Romanian, published in '48 in Romania. It was like a religious item to see the book here. I had never seen it. The translations are amazing. There are some poets I read only in his translations when I don't have the language, for example, in Russian. Osip Mandelstam, I don't like any of the translations into either French or English that I know of, but Celan's German translations, to me, seem the only ones in which whatever Mandelstam was up to in Russia and that I can't get to comes over to at least a serious extent. Gisèle Celan died in 1991, way too early at 64. The etching she gave me on one of my visits still hangs on the wall to the right of my desk, and I look at it daily. I was extremely pleased when just 10 years later, in 2001, Éditions du Seuil and Zurkam simultaneously published a 2-volume collection of correspondence between Paul and Gisèle, certainly the best and most accurate biography of the poet and his wife we have at this point. And it was a bit for producing an accurate way of reading Paul's life that this was done so very quickly. Basically by two people, Bertrand Badiou, the French Celan researcher, who is also the close collaborator with Eric Celan, Paul Celan's son, who by now had become the person dealing with both of his parents' works. Let me read you one letter from that volume, one letter that he sent to Gisèle on Sunday, the 21st of August, 1965, at 7 in the evening. My darling, not a very good day yesterday, despite your beautiful Thursday letter and the phone call. Clearly, this publishing house that sends me without cover letter, letters addressed to me personally, opened? No, that will not do. My question, though protocolered by Dumitriou, concerning those 2 major American publishing houses interested in my work, a postcard from New York sent by dear Tutti 2 or 3 years ago, still unanswered. They needed, those bastards, a well-known German language writer who could also launch a lyric series for them. So, with the help of that oh-so-literary bastard Hirsch, they set a trap for me, and I fell for it, counseled by my friends Ingeborg, Lenz, and Schaluk. Anyway, this afternoon, the Cinematheque again. October, or rather 10 days that shook the world, after the John Reed book I gave you a few years back, directed by Eisenstein. The USSR has brought it out of its archives, this movie from before the Stalinist terror, made in 1928, and on the credits, before the pictures, one could read that it was dedicated to the proletariat of Peter, the popular name for Petersburg. So, you know me, I applauded. Psst, no reaction. That's the answer I got, forcing itself on a theater where no one backed up my applause. Yet there were readers of the Observateur, but the Observateur, that's leftism. That's the lovers of the série noire, the homosexuals, the ITHEG, the hip Marxists, etc., etc. So, all alone, I saw Petersburg, the workers, the sailors of the Aurora. It was very moving, at times reminding one of the Potemkin, bringing to mind the thoughts and dreams of my childhood, my thoughts of today and of always. Poetry always true, always faithful. I saw my placards, many of them, those that not very long ago I evoked in a poem I send you, vapor band, banderole, uprisings. I saw the October Revolution, its men, its flags. I saw hope always en route, the brother of poetry. I saw. Then at a certain moment, at the moment when the insurgents occupied the Winter Palace, it began to desert poetry and to become cinema, motion picture shots, tendentious and overdone. The intertext became propaganda. All that was history and its personages had anyway been, from the very beginning, what was the least convincing. The role of the left socialist revolutionaries was completely expunged. So then, the heart loosened, searched for its silences, won, lost, won again, wrapped them around itself and led me outside, alone, as I had come in, running the gauntlet between young cinephile gents and young ladies mit tupierter Frisur, with too much makeup in pants, sort of leftist 16th arrondissement, erratic and flabby. But there was some, no doubt, who knew, taking here too responsibility for the terrible eclipses. Long live the sailors of Kronstadt. Long live the revolution. Long live love. Long live Petersburg. Long live Paris. Long live poetry. Paul. I thought also that that would be a good poem to occupy with, if we occupied Celan. Very sharp political sense Celan has, which also often gets lost when he's talked about, when he's thought of. He was a very political man, and to work is political all the way through. You know, that's certainly there. And when you read those letters, you really get that sense of. So I, in '87, returned to the US via an Iowa International Writers Invite. I then joined my old friend Jerome Rothenberg in Binghamton, New York, and for visa purposes I got a graduate assistantship and started to work on my doctoral thesis in Comp Lit, which would consist of the revised, yet one more time, 3 volumes of late Celan, plus a 150-page essay on the work. Meanwhile, Jerry and I co-edited and translated PPPPPPP, that's the selected writings of Kurt Schwitters, and began to conceive and organize the poems for the Millennium anthologies. In the summer of '89, I moved to Encinitas, California, where the Rothenbergs had returned to, and finished my Celan thesis. Interestingly enough, when I went back to the second, more open and free version of Brestern that I mentioned earlier, the one made in Algeria, I found that I had gone too far. And I went back, reworking the earliest, the tighter, the more literal version, in light of the information of the secondaire literature that had begun to proliferate like weed. There are now over 3,000 items in the secondary literature, books and essays combined. There's no way of reading them all because some are in languages that I certainly have no access to, and so on. Celan's German, let me quote a few paragraphs from the introductory essay of that dissertation, which dealing with the difficulties exactly of translating Celan. I quote myself. Celan's German strongly distances itself from any use that language was put to, both in literature and as vehicle for spoken communication, either before or during the poet's lifetime. It is a truly invented German, thus a language that poses special difficulties to the translator, who first has to locate the language, or rather the languages, from which Celan has translated his poetry into German. The sources are manifold. To cleanse his language of historical political dirt, Celan has often gone to earlier forms of German, so that medieval or late medieval words and etymologies need to be tracked down. Similarly, rare or dialectical North and South German, Austrian words no longer in current use or known only to dialectical speakers make frequent appearances, baffling even native German speakers. Celan was an assiduous reader and user of Grimm's Wörterbuch, Grimm's Great Dictionary, probably the most important reference book for tracking down Celan's language. That's the most important book for a translator. Is not a German-English dictionary, but the German-German dictionary, the Grimm's old book. For the same purpose, Celan went to other politically uncontaminated vocabularies, such as those of the natural sciences, especially botany, ornithology, and entomology, but also geology, mineralogy, geography, chemistry, crystallography, nuclear physics, current and space-age technology, hunting, anatomy, physiology, medicine. Medicine, which was gaining in importance in the later work, as he was more often went through psychiatric hospitals and was medicated. So the relationship to the terminology of medicine became central to some extent. But even the ability to determine the origin of a given word rarely resolves the translator's problem. In German, most of the technical and scientific terms are composite forms of common German words. And in Celan's use of the terms, those common word roots shine through, creating multiple levels of meaning. In English, such vocabularies are mainly based on Greek or Latin roots, which severs any use from the common connection in the language, reducing the multi-level play of meaning. Take, for example, the expression Laufkatze leben from the poem Hafen, Harbor. Celan wants the reader to hear the compound word made up from the word Katze, cat, and Lauf, meaning run, as descriptive of Leben, of life, right? But the word Laufkatze is also, and unavoidably so in the harbor geography of the poem, the technical apparatus called in English a trolley or trolley hoist, right? Unable to find an English equivalent of that, I try to play with a paratactic juxtaposition of both meanings. So combined with the use of the female pronoun she rather than the expected it, so that it is a trolley hoist, running cat or life, juxtaposed in a way, concreted, but impossible to do that with the economy that Celan did it, of course. To complicate matters further, Celan often creates neologism based on analogical word constructions in which it is essential to hear or see the original word. For example, in the paronomastic formation rauchdünn, smoke thin, you hear the very common expression hauchdünn, wafer thin, right? But of course, Rauch immediately gives you a very complex thing in Celan that goes back all the way to, if you want, to Todesfuge, to the smoke in the crematoria. So those kind of moves inside of language are, of course, very, very difficult to translate. Seasoned German commentators, by the way, have often been caught claiming that a given word is a neologism, when in fact, if you had a quick look into the dictionary, you would see that this was actually a German word, or had been a very common word long ago. Two examples, Steindattel and Meermühle. Conversely, one often comes across a word that looks and feels like a real German word, real, between parentheses, between quotes, but when trying to trace it down, you realize that it is a pure Celan invention. So one gets, Celan destabilizes one's relation to language continuously. And I think that is very important. That is one, a very political and poetically a very important thing to have done. So this creates a linguistic minefield through which the reader, and a fortiori the translator, has to move with extreme care. Celan has claimed, and I quote, "At bottom, my word formations are not inventions. They belong to what's most ancient in language," end of quote. And that's a statement maybe philosophically true for its author, but one that does not bring philological solace to the translator. Let's look at some detail at the further example, that well-known poem Todtnauberg, relating the first meeting with the philosopher Martin Heidegger in the letters Hütte, and a poem that's clearly critical as far as Celan's expectation of the meeting is concerned. I'll read it in my English translation. Todtnauberg, Arnica, eyebright, the draught from the well with the star die on top. In the Hütte, written in the book, whose name did it record before mine? In this book, the line about a hope today for a thinker's word to come in the heart. Forest sword, unleveled, orchis and orchis singly. Crudeness later while driving, clearly, he who drives us, the man, he who also hears it, the half-trod log trails on the high moor. Humidity, much. Now, for those interested, I have a longish essay on this poem and its various translations in my recent book of essays, Justifying the Margins. So permit me to limit myself here to a very few quick remarks. Vowel problems. The first German line has two initial A's, A in German, right? That very optimistic open. Arnica, Augentrost, very optimistic. Healing plants, both are healing plants, we know arnica. Of course, in English, I can reproduce the first, arnica, but the second word becomes eye, bright, an E rather than the R of arnica. So that is still an optimistic healing suggestion, so you don't have that twinning anymore exactly as it is in German. This is, however, important in the sense that later on in the poem there is a juxtaposition with two other plants, orchis and orchis. The dark O rhyming or unrhyming with the bright A's at the beginning. So arnica, eyebright, Celan comes to Martin Heidegger's heart, hoping for a healing connection. Later they take a walk, and things have gone bad already. Now it's orchis. And orchis is the flower, but it also is a word and a connection that goes back in another poem to the image in the shape of the testicle, coming from to testify, right? So it's all kind of connections go out that way. And here you have orchis and orchis. You have two single figures, as against those opening ones. So very complex, very difficult to deal with this. Then there is another word, Waldvase. One dig deeper. And when you look at it at first, you think, oh, he's using an old term for Waldwiese, right? Waldwiese is a forest meadow, a glade, one of those nice romantic things that, sheep and poets jump around in traditionally. Well, but why did he use Vasa rather than Wiese? So if you then begin going to the dictionary, Grimm, you'd notice that Vasa, to begin with, is not just the surface, is not the surface green, but is the sod with the plant roots that are underneath it. So Celan is looking inside, is looking through the surface. He's already in a certain depth in relation to this. He's looking at that. In North Germany, the term Vasan is used as a synonym for torf or turf, peat. And peat, they think of Danish peat bogs and so on, bogs that conserve prehistoric, prehistoric bodies and so on. Whoops, the term Waldvase has already become much more difficult. Even so, it has those two A's that unrhyme with the light A's of the opening lines. The word has already become slightly unheimlich, uncanny, to use one of Heidegger's favorite words. There is more. Grimm further glosses Vasen as the piece of land on which the Necker, or Vasenmeister, guts and buries the dead livestock. The Necker's yard, which one could also translate as the killing fields. Celan's substitution of Vasen for Wiesen is meaningful and intended as such, to say the least. Walking over the Vasen, Celan cannot but be close to that realm he is most familiar with, the realm of the dead. Celan had come to see Heidegger to ask for a word of apology in relation to the events of the Second World War, the destruction, like cattle, of the Jews. As I read Grimm on Vasa and found the Necker's yard, I thought I had gotten to the bottom and maybe had gone too far in interpretation, i.e. translation. Then my eye fell on another Vasa, a word current in North Germany and used to describe a bundle of dead wood, the etymology of which Grimm traces back through the French word faisceau to the Latin word fasces, i.e. the curator's bundle of rods with the axe projecting, which became the symbol and gave the word for fascism. You see what happens there. Now you could suggest that this kind of mole work goes too far, that the associational network one could thus spin would eventually cover everything, and thus also fetter the translator. But it is the reader or translator But is the reader or translator or exegete digging too deep under the surface of the poem's word when proceeding in the same way Celan himself proceeded in creating his poem? I don't think so. Any attempt to translate Celan has to deal with this vertiginous aspect of the work and despair to ever be able to render it accurately. I have not found an English word that would be accurate to the polysemous levels of the German Vasan, and I probably won't. During the early 90s, after Gisèle's death, I contacted Eric, the Celan's son, who until his mother's death had not taken much interest in the father's work, understandably so, as a child he had witnessed some very upsetting scenes during Paul's last years. But Eric now took on the role of literary and artistic executor of both parents' estates, and has done so brilliantly ever since. It was Eric who saw that Celan's work needed more translations to do it justice, and it was with his help that Douglas Messerly and Sun and Moon were finally able to acquire the rights to publish my translations. The first volume, Breastone, came out in '95 in beautiful hardcover and paperback editions, and the next two volumes were supposed to appear in '96 and '97. Unhappily, it would take 10 years to bring the books out, as Messerly's Sun and Moon press began to run into trouble, usual trouble of small presses, money. He did bring out the 3 volumes, but what I had hoped would be a uniform edition as well designed as the first volume wouldn't be. Still, I was most happy that the long wait was over. The book I'd originally finished translating in 1969 was out, a bare 26 years later. At this point, all 3 are out of print, but my Paul Celan Selection volume, which is here on the table, is available, and I just got an NEA grant to spend next year working on a collected late Celan. So I'll go over all those volumes, add the others to it, and some notes and commentaries. Now, Celan comes into the 21st century as maybe the major German poet of, the latter part of the 20th century. And the work gets taken on a bit everywhere. The work is taken on by musicians, it is taken on by painters, and so on. Sometimes, I would think, misused. But there is, for example, one composer, to give you a little taste, called Kyle Smith, and I very much like his, what he did with the poem Before Your Late Face from Breastone. I'd love us to be able to listen to all of it, but we are running out of time. So from the music, let's go to the painters. And concerning them, I've been following the work of the Chicago-born poet Irving Petelin for many years, and knew that he was at work on a series of paintings dealing with writers whose work addressed the question of the Shoah and survival. Primo Levi, but also a poet I had been close to, Edmond Jabez. It was thus not exceedingly, though very pleasantly surprising for me when Irving asked me in late 2001 to write an introductory essay for a catalogue of a large show of a new series of paintings based on poems of Paul Celan. The first thing I noticed was how carefully Petelin approached the matter with a painting called The Disappeared for Paul Celan from 1966, not on screen, in which a brightly lit window in the foreground could be Celan's room, where we could imagine the poet at work witnessing. It will take Irving Petelin several more paintings before he dares to step completely into Celan's universe, into what I have called elsewhere Celan's fearful polysemy. Such circumspection, such care honors both painter and poet, and arises from Petelin's sense that there was something in his work that terrified me. And this something was related, so Irving, to Celan's willingness to descend into the deepest recesses of the brain cavity. Why this awe when faced with the work of Celan? As we move into the 21st century, it does become clear that Celan is the one European poet of the second half of the previous century we cannot avoid, because he is a threshold, a hinge, a gate that both closes the past century and opens upon the possible land and humanscapes of the new one. The gate may be narrow, indeed it needs to be narrow. It is after all an Engführung, a straightening, a leading into the narrows, as Celan had it. I have long imagined Celan's work as such a threshold and gate, and now meet versions of these in the shape of the two Petelin paintings, the red door and the white door. Could the red door be the one that swings shut or looks back on the bloody 20th, with war-related death estimated 187 million? While the other door, the white one, is the blank, empty one facing the new century. White here, however, not so much as the color of innocence or purity or the new, but as the color of absence, of the unknown, the not yet, and thus of dread at least as much as of hope. Both colors have complex associations, and red could also be read as the color of the lifeblood coursing through Celan's aortic arc. I have thought of Celan as this gate for a long time now, and in front of Petelin's door, Kafka's well-known story comes to mind as I meditate on those red thread beings, strange Kalipoth, the empty shells of the Kabbalistic tradition, maybe the offsprings of the thread sons of another Celan poem, waiting for the gates to open. The titles of these two paintings both use the line, "All is less than it is, all is more," from the poem Cello Entry, a poem that does not mention a gate or a door. But the latter images are universal images of a change of place and mind, life and death, and related dualities. They function as such throughout Celan's work, who speaks, for example, in an earlier poem of a changing key that will open the house wherein drifts the white snow of all that has been forgotten, and this key will change depending on the red blood that pours from eye or mouth. Door and gate thus refer to the realms of time and space, to those of the lived life in place and history, but also to metaphysics, as Celan may well have had in mind Martin Buber's tale of the Hasidim, where Rabbi Bunam says, "Man is always passing through two doors, out of this world and into the next, and out and in again." By now you may think I should feel that whatever debt I owed Celan had been paid back. But this notion of a debt owed I had picked up from Maurice Blanchot's work, where he adds the adjective infinite to the word debt, making it an existential, not a purely literary matter. And indeed, that's how I saw my debt towards the man who had brought me to poetry, an infinite debt that could never be repaid, but could only be worked at, not worked off. It thus took me only a short time to agree to another project of translation, the Meridian final version, drafts materials by Paul Celan, the 300-page Variorium edition of the 14-page essay, Celan's major poetic statement, Der Meridian, which he gave as a speech when he received the George Büchner Prize in 1960. As Providence would have it, I was invited to the American Academy in Berlin later that year, and so was able to spend fall 2003 in that city on the Wannsee, eerily enough, exactly across from the place where the Nazis held that so-called Wannsee Conference, where the extermination of the Jews was decided, the final solution was set up. I got started on the translation, but also used the occasion to visit the places in Berlin that Celan had visited. Nicole Peyrafitte videoed those occasions, and you already saw the visual comments on the Anhalter Bahnhof. During his last visit to Berlin, Celan had written a poem concerned with Rosa Luxemburg's death. With my friend, the poet and Celan scholar Hans Michael Speyer, we followed the traces of poet and poem. Here is the poem and the video.
You lie in the great listening, ambushed, snowed in. Go to the Spree, go to the Havel, go to the butcher hooks, to the red apple steaks from Sweden. Here comes the table with the presents. He turns around in Eden. The man became a sieve, the woman had to swim the sow for herself, for no one, for everyone. The Landwehr Canal will not roar. Nothing stops.
In 2005, Douglas Messerly finally published the third volume, Light to Rest, but at that time I was completely involved in translating the Meridian. Now, part of that book is a radio essay that Celan wrote around his brother, really, the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam. What Celan says about Mandelstam's view of life and poetics is about as close as one can come to Celan's own views. Here, an extract from the radio essay, which is built around two alternating commenting male voices, played here by myself and Charles Bernstein.
In 1913, a small volume of poetry was published in St. Petersburg entitled The Stone. These poems clearly carry weight. As the poets Georgy Ivanov and Nikolai Gulamev admit, one would like to have written them oneself, and yet these poems estrange. Something, remembers Sinade Hippias, who was centrally involved in the literary life back then and who had a way with words. Something had gotten into them.
Something strange, as various contemporaries report, which also applies to the author of the volume, Osip Mandelstam, born in 1891 in Warsaw and who grew up in St. Petersburg and Pawlowsk, and about whom it is known, among other things, that he studied philosophy in Heidelberg and is presently enamored of Greek.
Something strange, somewhat uncanny, slightly absurd. Suddenly you hear him break into laughter on occasions where a completely other reaction is expected. He laughs much too much and much too loudly. Mandelstam is oversensitive, impulsive, unforeseeable. He is also nearly indescribably fearful. If, for example, his route leads past a police station, he'll make a detour.
And among all the major Russian poets who survived the first post-revolutionary decade, Nikolai Gumilev,
okay, for the sake of time, we'll
shorten that one. It's a wonderful essay, and it does in the book, The Meridian, that's out there. There's a pitch to the crowd. And I'll say a few more words on that book. That translation was, as I said in the introduction, probably the most epic endeavor in this discipline I have undertaken. By comparison, the translation of the 4 volumes of Celan's poetry, starting with Breastone, took me only about half the time this book took. The reasons will be obvious. The difficulties of trying to render minute differences between 4 and more parallel German versions or drafts, while staying true to and rendering the typographical layout of the original transcriptions. These scholarly transcriptions of all the extant textual variants of Celan's meridian speech include a complex apparatus to reproduce deletions, inserts, additions, and a further range of minuscule changes, capital to lower letters, etc., which I try to maintain as closely as possible in the English. Except, of course, permit me to add this now here, outside the margins of the printed book, when in my desperate madness I just throw the book against the wall, hoping that all the insertion points and deletion marks would somehow either fall off the pages and or reassemble themselves into the English text as needed. I did finish the work, finally. It became complex to do it because publishers now want camera-ready copy. How to do that? They're impossible. But I finally convinced the publisher to Stanford University Press to reset the whole thing, and they saw the importance of it, and the book is now out 9 years later. Permit me to conclude by reading just one short, quick definition of poetry that Celan uses in that book. The poem speaks of the first and most accidental things as if they were the last ones. The near is at the same time the infinitely distant. If it has the opacity of what stands opposite it, it also has the brightness of the far away. Thank you.